Do you remember back in, maybe it was like ninth grade social studies where this gets taught? Do you remember learning about immigration and push factors and pull factors? I think the way it works is that anytime somebody moves from one place, one culture to another, there are usually push factors and pull factors. The push factors are the ones that are about, stuff not going so well where they lived at first, and they're kind of wanting to make a change to get away from some things that are pushing them out the door. And then you got the pull factors, like the desirability of another place that somebody might want to move to and the opportunities that might be there. Well, the whole message of the Bible follows a rather similar structure. That is, there are things about the world system and the unfolding of history and people left to their own ends and the consequences of sin and death and all of these things that are just hardwired into us as individuals and also hardwired into the whole story of history. These are all things that the authors of the Bible, the prophets, Jesus himself points to as being reasons to turn to God, because the metaphorical kingdom in which we live right now, it's broken, it's a dead end, it's not going to work out. And so it's a push factor. But then there's also all of this stuff about the blessings of God and the kingdom of God and the character of God and the potential of people made in the image of God who realize that in union with God and what that means for eternity and the lightness of forgiveness of sins. Like all of this beautiful pull factor kingdom values stuff is sitting there. So it's not like just a biblical invitation for the reader to be like, oh man, I don't like how world kingdom stuff feels. I'm going to retreat from that off into the woods somewhere and just live small. No, it's an invitation to life abundantly. It's also a pull factor call towards something that is big and awesome and great. And throughout the book of Matthew, a ton of the pull factor stuff has been referenced with the values of the kingdom and the Beatitudes and what it looks like to follow Jesus. It is very, very exciting stuff. But in Matthew 24, it seems like we're getting more of a sense of the push factor stuff. Like, hey, these are things that are really never going to get right about the world, and the world is going to shake and quake and hurt a lot worse before anything gets better and this kingdom stuff that we've been talking about is fully realized. And in referencing that stuff in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus isn't just making it up out of thin air and being like, well, I think things are going to get pretty tough here for a while. There's going to be some difficult things coming and some pretty dramatic changes. Things are going to shake up everything you know about existence. But that's just my opinion. I just think about it the other day, and that's how it is. No, as we've discovered over the last several days of looking at it, he is alluding to a massively pronounced theme throughout the Old Testament, and I believe specifically alluding even to at least half a dozen passages in the Old Testament that talk about all of these reckonings, all of this judgment that is to come. And quick side note, controversy. An intelligent person who's a patron of this program and who I like, named Michael, offered some pushback on the last few conversations. I don't have the comment in front of me, but it was thoughtful and intelligent. His suggestion was, he's just referencing back to themes in the passage we're looking at in Matthew 24. He's not referencing back to the specific verses that I think he's referencing back to. And to that I would say, yeah, Michael might have a point. Could be. But I think all of those verses we've looked at over the last few days are so interconnected, and that the prophets are even interacting with each other, and that there's a continuity between all of those prophecies that we looked at in the Old Testament, that I'm not sure Jesus can just reference one of those. By referencing one, he's really invoking all of them. And because there's such overlap between all of those different Old Testament prophecies in specificity, I have to think he is meaning to play on each of those notes to point out to his audience that this isn't just a verse or a prophecy I'm referencing from the Old Testament. When I talk about the unfolding of time, I think Jesus is saying like, all of the prophets testify to this. But I also have to acknowledge that Michael might have a point, and perhaps another way to look at this is just a broad brush of thematic referencing on the part of Jesus here. For me, Jesus' language seems to line up tightly enough that I think he is specifically trying to draw our attention to several of these well-known passages. But whatever the reality of it, I really appreciate Michael's thoughts, and thanks for being a patron, dude. But what I do think is even less debatable from Jesus' words in Matthew 24, 29 through 31 is the fact that his reference to the Son of Man and the Son of Man's return definitely points us back to Daniel in a way that is next level inarguable. Here's what Jesus said, just to jog your memory. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. We looked at that a whole bunch recently. Now on to this. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory, and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now look, even if we've never read any other part of the Bible, if you've been hanging around with me as we've worked through the book of Matthew, that stuff should ring a bell, right? Because he uses that language about himself a couple of times. Well, he uses the language Son of Man a ton, but in conjunction with this imagery about this sifting or sorting out, I mean, that takes us back to Matthew 13, the kingdom parables discourse, and the parable about the wheat and the tares, my favorite one in the whole Bible. And as you recall, Jesus says this when explaining what that parable is about. It says, as the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man, will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. So clearly, when he uses this language in Matthew 24, this is not a new idea to anyone who has been following him around. He's already tipped his hand to say this is how things wind up at some point. There is a reckoning. And at that point, God, not you, not me, thankfully, but God will do the sorting out and he will do the judging because he's qualified to do so. But also, back in Matthew chapter 8, we get another reference to this Son of Man idea, and it comes in that little interlude in Capernaum where Jesus is just starting to super popular and everybody's getting excited about him. And he healed Peter's mother-in-law and some other people. And then a couple of folks come up to him, remember? And they're like, I'm totally going to follow you. You seem great. I definitely want to do this. And the one guy is like, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus replied, yeah, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And then you recall the other one's like, let me go bury my dad. And Jesus is like, let the dead bury their own dead. And if that sounds weird to you, and listen to that episode, you might want to go back and listen because we tackle all of the potential social weirdness of that. But what I really want to draw your attention to is that language, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. When he called himself the Son of Man here, as you will recall, that was not a meaningless throwaway phrase. He was invoking something that his original audience would have known, and it was a reference back, maybe most observably, to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel has this vision, and the vision involves something that is like a son of man, according to Daniel. And then as we continue to look around the rest of the Bible, we discover that this son of man thing is, one, Jesus' most favored title for himself, his most oft-employed title for himself. Two, it's a title that really clearly indicates the incarnational humanity of Christ. And three, it's the one that gets to the relatability. I mean, he gets called Son of David. He gets called Son of God. And I suppose Son of David speaks to his regality and his authority to occupy the eternal throne forever. And I suppose the Son of God thing speaks to his deity. But the Son of Man thing speaks to his accessibility. It speaks to what the plan is, the mission, that Jesus is the culminating event of the redemptive plan, that all the stuff that's going to get made right is going to get made right through Jesus. And all of the sorting out and reckoning that's coming later, he's going to be there for that too. So in Daniel chapter 7, we get this vision. In my vision at night, I looked, this is verse 13, by the way, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days. In my translation, the A in ancient and the D in days is capitalized. And he was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Dang! Every now and then, you aren't around the Old Testament for a little while, and you're like, maybe the Old Testament stuff is kind of like blah, 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 and it kind of points toward Jesus, but maybe we just want to see it there so bad that we read it in. But then other times you look at it and you're like, dang, the Old Testament is just this resonating clear as can be, inarguably begging for Jesus to complete the last notes and pointing a finger across the centuries and screaming to anybody who will listen, that is the one who is God in the flesh, who is the culminating event that resolves all of history, that solves all of the problems, that draws us toward all of the beautiful things. That's the guy right there. I got excited and struck the microphone. I apologize for that. And that's what Jesus is deftly pointing people back toward when he refers to himself as the Son of Man. I am the one who was to come. I am the one who will come on the clouds, as is clearly articulated by Daniel from that vision. So then when we skim back through Matthew and think about the times Jesus uses the language Son of Man, it's like, okay, there's a little bit of a hint. There's a little bit more of a hint. But when we get to Matthew chapter 24 and we see him use that language, it's like, okay, dang, now it's just crystal clearly spelled out. He is the Son of Man referenced in Daniel. That's one of those loose ends that was still kind of hanging around from the Old Testament. He is the one who will come on the clouds in authority, unmissably. He is the one who, as referenced in the parable of the wheat and the tares in Matthew 13, will show up with this loud trumpet call, which is also alluded to in Isaiah 27, and then will gather his elect from the four winds, which is referenced heavily earlier on in Daniel 7, verse 2, and in Zechariah chapter 2 as well. We did a ton of specific Old Testament Bible the last few days. You can go and look those up for yourselves and see the smoking gun if you want to. In summary, to the original audience, this would have been a very easy thing for them to understand. And for the right now, you and me audience, it's not even really that hard to just go and read a little bit of context and read a few verses and have it be very clear to us as well, though it takes a tiny bit more effort than it probably did for the original audience. What he's saying is that all of the push factors of history that have been alluded to throughout everything else that is Bible and the whole story of everything that's been going on with humanity and with God and failure and sin, judgment, and brokenness and death and all that stuff, Jesus is the answer to that eternally. He is the resolution. He is the culminating character, the culminating event, not just right now at the moment he was saying that, but into the future as well. His reconciliation, his resolution of all of these tensions and problems, all of the push factors is not done. And it's going to be a little while before it is fully completed, but it will be fully completed in him. That's the promise he's making. That stuff from Daniel and the rest of the Old Testament is what he's claiming he's the fulfillment and completion of. And that's the promise that the text holds out for any reader of any age at any point, looking back at these words and trying to understand what the game plan of history is and what exactly it is that God is promising is going to happen. Resolution, reconciliation with God, restoration, defeat of that which is evil. All of that is coming, and all of that is still to come in Jesus. Starting tomorrow, we move forward into the next chunk of Matthew chapter 24, where we're dealing with the same subject matter, but it takes a bit of a tonal turn in a way that I think you're going to find interesting. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.